Imagine the fog slowly drifting over the dark waters of the Dnieper in the cool dawn hour. Somewhere in the distance, through this fog, the outlines of ancient fortress walls peep through, and on the hills, the golden domes of churches shimmer like stars that have descended to earth. In this silence, filled with the scent of river water and smoke from hearths, a history was born that became the basis of an entire civilization. The history of the state we know today as KIEVAN RUS. Greetings, my dear listeners, and I invite you to write in the comments what city you're from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Close your eyes and imagine the 9th century AD. This is the time when rivers slowly flowed across the vast expanses of Eastern Europe, carrying not only their waters, but also the ships of traders, warriors, and travelers. These rivers were the arteries of life, linking distant lands by invisible threads of trade relations and cultural exchange. And it was here, on these river routes, in the lands where forests rumbled and steppes stretched, where scattered tribes of Slavs, Finno-Ugrians, and Balts lived, that something wonderful was to be born. The waves were lapping quietly on the banks of the Volkhov, when somewhere in the northern lands, in the land of white nights and harsh winters, events were unfolding that would change the course of history. The 862nd year after Christmas brought changes that will be remembered for centuries. The northern Slavic and Finno-Ugric tribes, tired of internecine strife and unable to find peace on their own, made a decision that seems paradoxical to modern man. They called upon foreigners, the Varangians RUS, to rule them. The chronicler, whose hand many years later wrote the lines of the tale of bygone years, has left us a testimony of this moment. Our land is great and abundant, but there is no order in it, said the ambassadors of the tribes. And came to them a man named Rurik, whose name sounded unusual to the Slavic ear, but who was destined to become the founder of the dynasty that ruled these lands for many centuries. Rurik first settled in Ladoga, an ancient lakeside settlement where trade routes converged and where northern and southern cultures mixed. But soon he moved to Novgorod, a city that was already an important hub of trade links. Here, among wooden walls and the ringing of bells that would appear many years later, the history of the Rurikovich dynasty began. But what was this tribe, this mysterious RUS, which gave a name to the future great state? This name is shrouded in the fog of time, as those very Dnieper banks in the morning hours. The most convincing version leads us to the ancient Scandinavian language, where the word meant rower, or campaign on rowing vessels. Through the Finnish language, it was transformed into Old Russian RUS. Initially, this name referred to the Scandinavians, varyags, those northern warriors and traders who on their rooks plowed the rivers and seas in search of wealth and glory. But gradually, like a drop of ink dissolving in water, this name spread to all the people of ancient Russia. Imagine these rooks gliding across the dark water in the moonlight. Their sides reflect the stars, and their oars cut the water smoothly. On the bow of each ship is a carved head of a dragon or some other mythical creature to protect sailors from the spirits of the water element. In the holds are swords and shields, silver jewelry and furs, amber and wax. These people were not just warriors or traders. They were a link between worlds, carriers of cultures and traditions. The economic prerequisites for the formation of statehood are rooted in the very trade routes that, like blood vessels, permeated the body of future Russia. The Baltic-Volga trade route connected the cold waters of the Baltic with the distant lands of the Volga region, with the mysterious Bulgaria, the mighty Khazaria, and the fabulously rich Arab Caliphate. Along this trade route, like pearls on a thread, settlements, trade and craft centers, and military camps sprang up, where the Scandinavian ethnic component gave a special flavor to local life. Here, at river crossings and at the mouths of tributaries, a new social structure was born. Simple farmers and hunters gradually witnessed the emergence of a new elite: warriors, skilled craftsmen, enterprising traders. Central power grew like a tree rooted deep in the fertile soil of economic opportunity. But let us return to the time when Rurik had already established himself in Novgorod, and his vigilantes had traveled the lands in search of new opportunities. Two of them, Askold and Deer, on their way to the great Constantinople, the city that beckoned all traders with its riches and opportunities, stopped in Kiev. This city, on the high Dnieper hills, was already an important hub of trade routes, a place where the roads from north to south and from west to east crossed. In the same 862nd year, Askold and Deer captured Kiev, and the city became their residence. Probably in those days, standing on the Kiev hills and looking at the wide ribbon of the Dnieper River stretching to the horizon, they could not have guessed what role this place was destined to play in history. Kiev was as if created by nature itself to become the center of a great state. Its high banks protected it from floods. The river provided a link to the sea and distant lands, and the surrounding forests and fields provided everything necessary for life and prosperity. But the real creator of the old Russian state was destined to become another man. His name was Oleg, and history knows him as prophetic, a nickname that speaks of wisdom and the ability to foresee the future. When in 879th year Rurik did not become, Oleg took care of the young son of the late prince, Igor, and became regent at him. Imagine a cold morning in the year 882. Fog rises over the Dnieper, and silhouettes of rooks appear on its waters. It is Oleg and his retinue moving downstream towards Kiev. In his eyes burns determination, and in his heart matures a plan that will change the face of the East Slavic world. He knows that Kiev is the key to controlling the most important trade route, the same route from the Varangians to the Greeks that connects the northern seas with the warm waters of the Black Sea and the splendor of Byzantium. Oleg did not just capture Kiev. He created a symbol. Having killed Askold and Deir, he declared Kiev to be the capital of his state, uttering words that would echo through the centuries. Let this be the mother of Russian cities. In these words sounded not just the pride of the conqueror, but a vision of the future, an understanding of the special place that this city would occupy in the fate of the emerging state. Oleg was not just a warrior, but also a visionary politician. He understood that the true strength of the state lies not only in military might, but also in the ability to unite disparate tribes under one authority, to give them a common goal and a common identity. Gradually, the Drevlians, who lived in dense forests and were famous for their tenacity, the Northmen and the Radimichi came under his hand. Each of these tribes had its own traditions, its own customs, its own way of life. But Oleg managed to find a way to unite them without destroying their identity. Time passed, and the glory of KIEVAN RUS spread far beyond its borders. In the year 977, Oleg made a campaign that shocked even mighty Byzantium. Imagine a fleet of Russian ships appeared at walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines, accustomed to their superiority on the seas, watched in horror as barbaric, seemingly ships approached their capital. This campaign ended not with destruction, but with a trade treaty, the first serious diplomatic success of the young state. Russian merchants were granted the right of duty-free trade in Constantinople, which opened up enormous opportunities for them. 4 years later, in the year 911, the first written treaty between Russia and Byzantium was concluded. This document, the lines of which have reached us through the centuries, regulated not only trade relations, but also legal and military issues. In it, we see a state that already realizes itself as an equal partner of the great empire, a state that speaks the language of diplomacy and law. But political success was only one aspect of life at that time. In forests and fields, in villages and towns, ordinary human life was going on. Peasants cultivated the land using 2-field and 3-field systems that produced sustainable harvests. Livestock farming provided meat and milk. Hunting provided furs and wild meat. And Bortniki provided honey and wax, which were highly valued both at home and abroad. Crafts developed in the cities, which were steadily growing in number. By the 12th century, the craftsmen of ancient Russia possessed more than 60 craft specialities. The ringing of hammers in forges mingled with the noise of pottery workshops, where not only utilitarian objects, but also real works of art were created. Jewelers mastered the most complex techniques: graining, scanning, cloisonné enamel, and niello. Their products were so perfect that they were not inferior to the best examples of Byzantine and Western European craftsmanship. But trade occupied a special place in the life of ancient Russia. It was not just an economic activity, but a kind of art, requiring knowledge of languages, customs of distant peoples, the ability to navigate by the stars and read the vagaries of river currents. The main trade route was the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks, a waterway that connected the Baltic Sea with the Black Sea through the Volkhov and Dnieper rivers. Along this route, merchant caravans carried sable and marten furs, wax and honey, flax and linen fabrics, silverware and weapons, as well as, alas, slaves, a sad reality of the time, southwards. From the south, from wealthy Byzantium and distant eastern countries, came luxury goods that seemed to the northerners like miracles. Silk fabrics, soft and shimmering in the candlelight, spices that filled the houses with exotic aromas, precious jewelry, and fine swords forged by the masters of Damascus. Flemish and Frisian fabrics, non-ferrous metals, silver, tin, lead, copper. All this flowed along the trade arteries of Russia, enriching it materially and culturally. There was another important trade route, the Volga route, which led from Ladoga to the Caspian Sea, opening the way to Khwarezm, Central Asia, Persia, and Transcaucasia. The third way, overland, connected Central Europe with Kiev, and further with the Volga and Asia. Thus, ancient Russia became not just a state, but a bridge between worlds, a meeting place for different cultures and traditions. When in 900, 12-year Oleg Prophetic has not become Igor Rurikovich, son of the founder of a dynasty, has ascended on a throne. His reign fell on times of new challenges and tests. The Pechenegs, a nomadic people whose horsemen appeared suddenly like a storm in the steppe, sowing fear and destruction, began to raid the Russian lands more and more often from the east. Igor was forced not only to defend his possessions, but also to continue his predecessor's policy of strengthening ties with Byzantium. He made 2 campaigns to Constantinople. The first, in 941st year, was unsuccessful. The Byzantines met Russian ships' Greek fire, that terrible weapon that burned even on the water. But the second campaign, in 944th year, ended with the conclusion of a new treaty, although on less favorable terms. Duty-free trade was cancelled. A tragic fate befell Igor in the year 945. While collecting tribute from the Drevliat, he decided to return for more levy, which led to an uprising. The Drevlians killed the prince, and this event could have been the end of the young state, if not for one amazing woman, Princess Olga, Igor's widow. Olga was not just a woman on the throne. She was a ruler whose intelligence and will left an indelible mark on history. Her revenge on the Drevlians became legendary. But far more important were her reforms, which laid the foundations for a stable state system. She introduced lessons, fixed amounts of tribute, and pogosts, special places for its collection. This may seem like a simple administrative decision, but in fact, it was a revolution in state administration. Instead of the chaotic apology when the prince and his retinue traveled around the subordinate lands and collected tribute as they had to, an orderly system was created that protected both the interests of the state and the rights of the payers. But Olga's most significant act was her conversion to Christianity. According to the most reasoned version, this happened in the year 957. Imagine this woman, brought up in pagan traditions, for whom the world was inhabited by spirits of forests and rivers, gods of thunder and fertility, suddenly accepting faith in the one God. It was not just a personal choice, but a political decision of great importance. Olga became the first ruler of KIEVAN RUS to officially embrace Christianity, paving the way for the great changes that would take place under her grandson. Her son, Sviatoslav, was a completely different person. If Olga was a wise ruler, Sviatoslav was a born warrior. He became the first Russian prince with the Slavic name that is symbolic. The state began to find the own identity. Sviatoslav Igorovich ruled from 962nd to 972nd year, and his reign was a continuous succession of military campaigns and conquests. The Byzantine historian describes him as a man of medium height, with bushy eyebrows, blue eyes, and a shaved head. on which only a tuft of hair remained, a sign of nobility. In one of his ears hung a golden earring with pearls and precious stones. He ate and slept with his warriors, setting an example of fortitude and unpretentiousness. "I'm coming at you," he warned his enemies without hiding his intentions, which spoke not of naivety, but of nobility and confidence in his own strength. Sviatoslav has subdued Vietici in 964th year, has crushed Volga Bulgaria, but the most significant, his act became destruction, Khazar Khaganate, in 965 year. Khazaria was the powerful power, controlling trade ways between Europe and Asia, collecting a tribute from many Slavic tribes. Sviatoslav has taken by storm Sarkel, Semender, and capital of Khaganate Ital. On the place of Sarkel, he founded the fortress Belaya Veja, and on the Taman Peninsula, the city of Temutarakan, which would become an important outpost of Russian influence in the Azov region. These conquests changed the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe. Rus turned into a serious regional force, capable of challenging even such ancient and powerful powers as Khazaria. But Sviatoslav dreamed of more. His eye turned to Danube, Bulgaria, where he intended to create a new state. Twice he made campaigns to these lands. Twice faced Byzantium in bloody wars. Byzantine chroniclers wrote anxiously about this northern prince who dared to defy the empire. They saw in him not just a barbarian, but a worthy opponent, whose courage and military skill deserved the respect of even his enemies. But fate was cruel to Sviatoslav. In 972nd year, returning from an unsuccessful Bulgarian campaign, he was ambushed by Pechenegs on the Dnieper Rapids, the same stony shoals that were both a blessing and a curse of the Dnieper trade route. From the skull of the dead prince, the Pecheneg Khan ordered to make a bowl shrouded in gold, a barbaric custom, which, nevertheless, testified to the respect that the enemies had for the valor of Sviatoslav. Sviatoslav's death led to a new feud between his sons. Yaropolk, Oleg, and Vladimir fought for their father's inheritance in a bloody war that could destroy everything that had been created by previous generations. But the victory was won by the youngest of the brothers, Vladimir, and his reign from 980 to 1015 years became a turning point in the history of ancient Russia. Vladimir Sviatoslavich completed the formation of the state territory by annexing the Chervan cities and Transcarpathia, finally subjugating Radimichi and Vietici. For protection from the Pechenegs, he built entire lines of fortresses and created a system of light warning, a chain of signal lights that could transmit news of danger from the border to the capital in a matter of hours. This was a real engineering revolution, testifying to the high level of organization of the state. But first, Vladimir tried to solve the question of the unity of the state in the old pagan way. In 980, he carried out a pagan reform, trying to establish the cult of Perun as the main god of all subordinate tribes. On a hill in Kiev was erected an idol of the formidable god Thunderer. Next to him stood images of other gods: Horse, Dazhejbog, Strybog, Semargl, and Mokosha. But this attempt failed. Pagan gods were too connected with tribal traditions to become the basis for uniting the heterogeneous population of a huge state. And then there was an event that changed not only Russia, but also the entire subsequent history of Eastern Europe. In 988, Vladimir decided to baptize Russia. This decision matured not overnight. Chronicles tell how to Vladimir came ambassadors of different religions: Muslims, Jews, Christians of the Western and Eastern rites. Each of them praised their faith, trying to induce the prince to accept it. But Vladimir's choice fell on Christianity of the Byzantine rite. And this choice was dictated not only by religious, but also by political considerations. Marriage with the Byzantium princess Anna opened before Russia possibilities of dynastic communications with one of the greatest empires of the world. The marriage was preceded by the capture of Chersonesos, an ancient city in the Crimea, which Vladimir used as a card in his diplomatic game with Byzantium. Imagine that day in Kiev when the pagan idols were overthrown. The idol of Perun, which had recently been a symbol of state power, was now dragged to the Dnieper and thrown into the water. And then began the mass baptism of the inhabitants of the city in the waters of the same river. Thousands of people entered the water, and at that moment, Russia was making a step into a new epoch of its history. The adoption of Christianity was like the spring sun melting the ice on a river, slowly but inexorably transforming the whole face of the earth. In Kiev began the construction of churches, and the first of them was the Tithe Church, laid in 989th year and consecrated in 996. It was the first stone church in Russia, built by Byzantine masters, who brought with them not only construction skills, but also a completely new understanding of space and beauty. The peculiarity of Byzantine Christianity, which benefited the Russian people, was the permission to conduct the service in the native language. In contrast to the Latin Rite, where all prayers sounded in the Latin language incomprehensible to the common man, the Orthodox divine service was conducted in Church Slavonic, close and understandable to all Slavic tribes. This meant that the new faith was not an alien force imposed from above, but was becoming part of popular culture, being woven into people's daily lives. But the Christianization of Russia was not an instantaneous process. The ancient gods and spirits lived in the depths of people's consciousness for a long time, and the new faith gradually merged with pagan beliefs, forming what historians call two faith. Peasants continued to honor the spirits of the forest and the field, to celebrate ancient festivals connected with the cycles of nature. But now these rites were intertwined with Christian festivals. Shrovetide was combined with the beginning of Lent, Ivan Kupala with the feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist. Thus, a unique culture was created in which deep Christian spirituality was combined with a poetic perception of nature, characteristic of Slavic paganism. After Vladimir's death, in the year 1015, the feud between his sons began again. Sviatopolk, nicknamed Okayani, killed his brothers Boris and Gleb, who were later canonized as the first Russian saints. This tragedy could have plunged the country into chaos, but out of the crucible of internecine warfare came a ruler who was destined to become one of the greatest in Russian history, Yaroslav, nicknamed the Wise. The reign of Yaroslav from 1019 to 1054 was the golden age of KIEVAN RUS. Imagine Kiev at that time, a city spread over 7 hills, like Rome or Constantinople. Its streets were full of life. Here you could hear speech in many languages: Slavic, Greek, Scandinavian, Cumans. Merchants from distant lands offered their wares. Craftsmen worked in the workshops. Students copied books in the monastery scriptoriums. Yaroslav realized that a great state should be based not only on the power of arms, but also on the power of law. He introduced a collection of laws, Ruskaya Pravda, the first written code of laws that regulated the lives of various strata of society. This document is amazing in its detail and wisdom. It established fines, vira, depending on the social status of the victim, regulated trade relations, and defined the rights and obligations of various categories of the population. In Russian Pravda, we see a society that has already gone far away from primitive tribal relations. There is nobility, Rurikovich, boyars, vigilantes who made up the ruling layer. There are free peasants, people who owned their plots of land and could freely dispose of them. There were smerdz, dependent peasants who worked on the Lord's land, cattlemen and villains, people who were in full dependence on the Lord's. Zakupas, half-free debtors who worked off their debt. Ryadovich, hired workers, and outcasts, people deprived of their social status, but were under the protection of the church. Interestingly, the Russian Pravda initially sanctioned blood feud, an ancient custom by which the relatives of a murdered person had the right to take revenge on the murderer. But gradually, blood feuds were legally banned, giving way to a system of monetary compensation. This was an important step in the development of legal consciousness, a transition from archaic forms of justice to more civilized ways of resolving conflicts. Yaroslav pursued an active foreign policy, and his diplomatic successes testified to the international recognition of Russia. His daughters became queens of European countries. Anna married the French king Henry I. Elizabeth married the Norwegian king Harald the Harsh. Anastasia married the Hungarian king Andras I. Yaroslav's sons also concluded dynastic marriages with representatives of ruling houses of Europe. Kiev in those times was not inferior in importance to Paris or Constantinople. One of Yaroslav's greatest victories was the final victory over the Pechenegs. These nomads had long been the scourge of the Russian lands, their raids bringing death and destruction, forcing peasants to abandon their fields and seek refuge behind fortress walls. But in the battle near Kiev, Yaroslav defeated the Pechenegs, and their raids stopped forever. On the site of this victory, St. Sophia Cathedral was laid, a symbol of the triumph of the Christian faith and Russian arms. The St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, built from 1037 to 1054, became a true architectural marvel. This cross-domed temple, with 13 chapters, amazed contemporaries with its splendor. Its walls were decorated with mosaics and frescoes created by Constantinople masters, with the participation of Kiev artists. Here, Byzantine art met local traditions, giving birth to a unique style that would become the basis of Russian church architecture. In the same years, the famous Golden Gate of Kiev was built, a stone defensive gate with a gateway church, which was supposed to symbolize the power and wealth of the capital. Travelers approaching the city saw these gates from afar and understood that they were approaching one of the greatest cities in the world at that time. But Kiev was not the only center of stone construction. In Novgorod, in the year 1045, the St. Sophia Cathedral was erected, five-domed, more austere in proportions, reflecting the severe character of the northern city. In Chernigov, in the 30s of the 11th century, built Spaso-Preobrazhensky Cathedral, which is considered the most Byzantine example of architecture in Russia. Each of these temples was not just a place of prayer, but a center of cultural life, a library, a school, a place where books were created and copied. The architecture of these temples followed strict canons. Inside, they were divided into the altar, a sacred place where only the clergy could enter. the sanctuary, the main space for those praying, and the narthex, a place for the public and penitents. The number of domes had a deep symbolic meaning. One dome symbolized the one God. 3, the Trinity. 5, Christ and the 4 evangelists. 13, Christ and the 12 apostles. Painting came to Russia together with Christianity, and Byzantine masters brought with them not only technical skills, but also a whole world of images and symbols. The mosaic Christ Pantocrator in the dome of Saint Sophia of Kiev looked at those praying with stern but merciful eyes, and Our Lady of Oranta in the altar stretched out her hands in a prayerful gesture, as if protecting the city and all its inhabitants. The frescoes told not only biblical stories, but also reflected everyday life. One could see images of Yaroslav the Wise's family, hunting scenes, skomoroks, circus performances. Icon painting also has deep roots in Russian culture. The icon of Our Lady of Vladimir, created by Byzantine masters in the 12th century, became one of the most revered shrines of Russia. The savior of the uncreated, Angel Zlati Vlasi. These images entered the homes and hearts of people, becoming companions in joy and sorrow. The first known Russian painter was the master Alipich, who lived at the end of the 11th century and worked in the Kiev-Pechersk monastery. But the adoption of the Byzantine heritage did not mean mere copying. Russian masters creatively reworked the received samples, creating works in which Byzantine refinement was combined with a special Russian soulfulness and closeness to nature. This was especially evident in literature. Written language existed in Russia even before the baptism, as evidenced by the 10th century treaties with Byzantium, written in Cyrillic alphabet. The work of the Solunian brothers, Constantine, who took the monastic name Cyril, and Methodius in the 9th century to create the Slavonic alphabet and translate the sacred books, prepared the ground for the flourishing of literacy. 2 alphabets, Cyrillic and Glagolitic, were used in Russia, although Cyrillic gradually supplanted the more complex Glagolitic. The oldest monuments of Russian writing have come down to us as evidence of the high level of culture of that time. The Novgorod Codex of the 10th to 11th centuries, the Ostromirov Gospel of the 1057th year, Sviatoslav's Izborniki of the 1073rd and 1076th years. Each of these books was not just a text, but a work of art. The scribes decorated them with intricate initials, miniatures, and ornaments. The 11th century birch bark letters found in Novgorod show that literacy was widespread not only among the clergy and nobility, but also among ordinary townspeople. Schools and libraries functioned. Yaroslav the Wise, according to a chronicler, gathered many scribes and translated from Greek into Slavonic. At monasteries and princely courts, real centers of books were created, where not only church texts were copied, but also works of secular literature, historical chronicles, and philosophical treatises. The literature of ancient Rus was closely connected with Byzantine and Bulgarian traditions, but original features quickly appeared in it. Chronicles became one of the most important and original genres of Old Russian literature. The tale of bygone years, compiled by the monk Nestor in 1113 in the Kiev-Pechersk monastery, was not just a chronicle of events, but an attempt to put the history of Russia in the context of the world historical process. Nestor began his tale from biblical times, tracing the path of mankind from Adam to contemporary events, showing that Russia is not an accidental branch on the tree of history, but a natural link in the divine plan of the universe. Other genres also flourished in this fertile atmosphere of cultural uplift. Sermons, hagiographies of saints, tales of military campaigns, all these texts were created not only for enlightenment, but also for spiritual edification. The tale of Boris and Gleb told of the tragic fate of Vladimir's sons, who became victims of a fratricidal war, but found glory as martyrs. Life of Theodosius of Pechersk told about the life of the great ascetic, the founder of Russian monasticism, whose image became an example for many generations. A special place in the literature of that time is occupied by the Word on Law and Grace of the Kiev Metropolitan Hilarion, created in the 11th century. This work was directed against the Byzantine claim to spiritual hegemony over Russia. Hilarion asserted the equality of all Christian peoples before God, proved that Russia has the right to its own way of development, not obeying anyone but the Almighty. In this text sounds the voice of a people who have already realized their strength and dignity. Time passed, and under Yaroslav the Wise, the so-called ladder system of succession to the princely tables was introduced. According to this system, power passed not necessarily to the son, but to the eldest in the family. This system seemed fair. It took into account clan traditions and ensured the continuity of power. But in it already were laid seeds of the future conflicts as to define who exactly is the senior in the expanded sort Rurikovich became more and more difficult. During Yaroslav's reign, crafts and trade developed, literacy flourished, and stone construction reached unprecedented heights. But perhaps the most significant achievement of this time was that Russia finally established itself as an equal participant in European politics. The dynastic marriages of Yaroslav's children linked the Russian princely house with the royal houses of France, Norway, Hungary, Poland, and Byzantium. After the death of Yaroslav the Wise in 1054th year, the power passed to his sons, who tried to rule jointly, dividing the country among themselves. But this system of triumvirate did not last long. Gradually, each of the princes sought to strengthen his own principality, and the unity of the state began to give cracks. The next significant ruler who managed to briefly restore the unity of Russia was Vladimir Monomakh. His reign from 1113 to 1125 was the period of the last strengthening of KIEVAN RUS. Vladimir was the grandson of Yaroslav the Wise on the maternal line, and has received the nickname in honor of the grandfather on the mother, the Byzantium Emperor Constantine Monomakh. The Statute of Vladimir Monomakh, also known as the Statute of Rezak, became an important social document. It softened the position of the lower strata of society, limiting the profits of usurers and easing the position of villains and zakupovs. This charter shows us a ruler who realized that the strength of the state depended not only on the wealth of the nobility, but also on the well-being of the common people. Vladimir Monomakh also organized joint offensive campaigns against the Polovtsians, a new nomadic people who replaced the Pechenegs. The Kipchaks were more organized and numerous opponents. Their raids caused huge damage to Russian lands. But the united forces of the Russian princes, under the leadership of Monomakh, managed to inflict a number of serious defeats on them, ensuring a peaceful life of the border regions. After Vladimir Monomakh, his son Mstislav, nicknamed the Great, ascended the throne of Kiev. His reign from 1125th to 1132nd year was the last period of political stability of the united KIEVAN RUS. Mstislav was a skillful diplomat and a wise ruler who managed to maintain a balance between the various centers of power within the state. But when Mstislav the Great died in 1132nd year, this fragile balance was broken. The chronicler recorded under 1134th year the prophetic words, "And the whole land of Rus was divided." Formally, it is 1132nd year is considered the beginning of the disintegration of KIEVAN RUS into independent principalities. This process was not a sudden cataclysm, but gradual, like the autumn withering of leaves. Novgorod, in 1136th year, Polotsk, in 1132nd year, ceased to recognize the authority of the Kiev prince. Each of the major principalities began to pursue its own policy, to conclude separate treaties, to wage wars in its own interests. The reasons for this disintegration lay deep in the very structure of the state. The increase in boyar land ownership led to the strengthening of local nobility, which needed the patronage of the distant Kiev prince less and less. The contradictions of the ladder system of succession gave rise to constant conflicts between princes. Each considered himself more worthy of the throne than his rivals. International trade communications also changed. The route from the Varangians to the Greeks, which had long been the basis of Kiev's economic prosperity, began to lose its importance. The Crusades opened new routes linking Europe and the East, bypassing the Russian lands. Venetian and Genoese merchants mastered the sea routes to the Levant, and goods that used to go through Kiev now traveled by other roads. Political instability also played a role. In the 12th century, there were 37 princes on the throne of Kiev, a figure that speaks for itself. The constant struggle for power drained the state's resources, prevented the implementation of consistent policies, and undermined the authority of the central government. The uprisings of the townspeople in Kiev testified that even the capital was not calm. The common people suffered from the arbitrary rule of princes and their vigilantes, from heavy taxes and endless wars. The city, which had once been a symbol of unity and power, was now itself becoming an arena of conflict. The symbol of the decline of Kiev was its sacking in 1169 by the troops of Andrei Bogolyubsky, Prince of Vladimir Suzdal. For the first time in history, the prince, having seized Kiev, did not stay there to reign, but returned to his northern possessions. Kiev, for it, was no longer the desirable capital, but simply one of many cities which it was possible to rob and to leave. In 1,203 years, the city was plundered a second time by Rurik Rostislavich, and these events finally undermined its importance as an all-Russian center. The territory controlled by the Kiev princes was steadily shrinking. Volyn was lost in 1154th year, Pereyaslav in 1157th year, Turov in 1162nd year. The once powerful KIEVAN principality was turning into one of many, and by no means the strongest. In the year 1299, there was an event that symbolically ended the era of the Kiev supremacy. The Metropolitan of all Russia transferred his residence from Kiev to Vladimir, and then, in 1325, to Moscow. The spiritual center of Orthodox Russia left the city that gave its name to the whole state. But even in the conditions of political disintegration, there were still factors that maintained the feeling of unity of the Russian land. The idea of unity continued to live in the hearts of people. Kiev formally remained the oldest city and the mother of Russian cities. Princely sort Rurikovich still occupied all local thrones that created a feeling of kinship between the rulers of various lands. The unified church, the Kiev Metropolitanate of all Russia, preserved spiritual unity and a common historical memory and awareness of ethnic community, supported the notion that the inhabitants of all Russian lands were one people. By the middle of the 12th century, the once united Russian land had divided into 13 to 18 independent principalities, each ruled by its own dynasty. Like a mighty tree that gave many shoots, KIEVAN RUS gave birth to a whole constellation of states. The Vladimir Suzdal Principality in the northeast, the Galicia-Volyn Principality in the southwest, the Novgorod Republic in the north, the Polotsk Principality in the west. Each of them had its own character, its own traditions, its own destiny. But this seeming chaos had its own logic. Like rivers flowing from a single source, these principalities preserved a common culture, a common faith, a common memory of unity. In each of them, the Church Slavonic language of divine service sounded. Temples were built according to Byzantine models. The same chronicles, beginning with the Kiev period of history, were rewritten. The Byzantine Empire had such a profound influence on the formation of Russian culture that its echoes can still be heard today. Imagine the moment in history when two great traditions met. The Byzantine, which inherited the richness of Greco-Roman antiquity and absorbed the spiritual treasures of the East, and the Slavic, young but full of creative energy. From this union was born a culture that combined the sophistication and depth of the Byzantine heritage with the special soulfulness and closeness to nature characteristic of the Slavic world. Not only priests and monks, but also architects, artists, craftsmen, singers, musicians, and merchants arrived in Russia from Byzantium. Each of them carried with him a piece of the great cultural heritage that had been accumulated for centuries in the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. But Russian craftsmen did not simply copy Byzantine samples. They creatively reworked them, creating works in which the Byzantine form was filled with Russian content. Church singing became an important element of Russian culture. In the silence of the temples, melodies sounded that seemed to be the voices of angels descending to earth. Instrumental music, according to Byzantine tradition, was rejected as too worldly. But the human voice, that most perfect of musical instruments, created a sound of unprecedented beauty and spiritual depth. But the people continued to live and develop a rich folklore. Calendar ritual poetry marked the change of seasons. Incantations appealed to the forces of nature. Tales kept the memory of heroic times. A special place was occupied by bailinas, epic songs about bogatyrs, defenders of the Russian land. Ilya Muromets, Dobrynya Nikitich, Alyosha Popovich. These names became symbols of Russian bogatarism, embodiment of the folk ideal of a just warrior. Folk tales about the events of the 2nd–6th centuries were reflected even in such an exquisite work as the Tale of Igor's Campaign, created in the 12th century. This literary masterpiece, which tells about the unsuccessful campaign of Prince Igor against the Polovtsians, strikes with its patriotism and connection with folk art. The author of the tale turns not only to Christian symbolism, but also to pagan images. He calls the winds, talks to the Dnieper, addresses the sun. In this work, Christian Russia remembers its pagan roots, and this memory makes its culture especially rich and multicolored. The Church waged a constant struggle against pagan customs, but many of them were preserved in folk life, intertwined with Christian holidays. Shrovetide and Easter, Ivan Kupala and Christmas, autumn harvest festivals, and winter holy days. In each of these festivals, the pagan past was combined with the Christian present, creating a unique flavor of Russian folk culture. But the peaceful development of this culture was destined to be interrupted. In 1223, there was an event that was a harbinger of the coming disasters. The first clash of Russian troops with the Mongols in the battle on the river Kalka. Almost all South Russian princes took part in this battle, but it ended in a crushing defeat. Many did not realize then the seriousness of the new threat that came from the depths of Asia. The Mongol invasion, which fell on the Russian lands in 1,237,240 years, was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Imagine a winter day on the 6th of December in 1240, when the flames engulfed Kiev, the city that for centuries had been the heart of Russian civilization. The Tithe Church, the first stone temple of Russia, collapsed under the blows of the enemy's wall-breaking machines. The St. Sophia Cathedral, a witness to the greatness of Yaroslav the Wise, was looted and pillaged. The Golden Gate, once welcoming ambassadors of European kings, lay in ruins. That day was the end of an era. Kiev had turned from a great capital into a small provincial town. Travelers passing through it a few years later numbered only about 200 houses, a pitiful remnant of a once great city. Many masters had been taken captive, libraries burned, works of art destroyed or exported. The Mongol invasion dealt the heaviest blow, not only to the political unity of Rus, but also to its cultural development. For several centuries, stone construction stopped, many crafts declined, and trade decreased. The Russian lands fell under the rule of the Golden Horde, and this yoke lasted for more than 2 centuries. But even in these harsh conditions, the thread of continuity was not broken. In the northern lands, in Novgorod, Vladimir, and later in Moscow, chronicles continued to be copied, churches were built, and crafts developed. The idea of the unity of the Russian land did not die, but acquired new forms. Gradually, three related but independent peoples, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, began to form out of the disparate principalities, each of which carried through the centuries the memory of its Kiev Russian roots. This was the end of the history of KIEVAN RUS, a state that in a few centuries went from a union of disparate tribes to a great European power, created a unique culture, and laid the foundations for the development of East Slavic civilization. Its legacy lives on today, in language and faith, in art and architecture, in the special spirituality that distinguishes the peoples who grew up on the banks of the Dnieper and Volkhov rivers. Good night, my dear listeners. May this story of greatness and tragedy, of ups and downs, of how nations are born and die, but the culture they have created never disappears without a trace, bring you good dreams. See you next time.